And I and I like this quite a bit because if you actually drive around Iowa and go to many parts of the state, these different landform regions are very, very noticeable. If you're at a place down in southern Iowa, like where we are in Iowa City, actually notice that there are quite a bit of steep sloping hills. You contrast that with the Des Moines Lobe area where glaciers last advance, and it's very, very flat. And so there's a bunch of other distinctions that we have around the state that influence both the land use and influence the soil type there. But everything starts with these landform regions. And so when it comes to talking about environmental issues in Iowa, it's often very convenient to break things up into these different parts of the state and trying to understand what's going on from a big picture standpoint. Other thing that we need to understand is that the modern landscape of Iowa is very, very, very different than it was 150 years ago prior to European settlement. We used to have tall grass prairie that dominated most of the state. So the tall grass prairie nowadays is very few and far between. I'm sure people might have seen some snippets of it from time to time in Iowa, but not much of it exists nowadays. We also had some forested areas and it's another landscape called oak savannas that was present around certain river valleys and present in certain parts of Iowa, kind of outside of the Des Moines Lobe region. But by and large, this isn't around anymore, and that's had really profound impacts on water quality and water quantity. This is a map that just highlights the degree of that change. So we see over here on the left-hand part of the slide, in that yellowish area, were all the areas where prairie, this tall grass prairie specifically, used to be present. It's a pretty clear comparison when you look at the 1830s to today, which we have shown over here on the right, where the big changes has most occurred. So much of that prairie landscape has been replaced with conventional agricultural practices or urban areas or suburban areas in the major metropolitan areas of Iowa. We do still have some grassland here, but it's not quite the same as the traditional prairie environment. So if you notice down in southern Iowa here, a good part of that land is used for grazing. And so we have different types of forage crops. So traditionally things like alfalfa or various types of hay. And so even some of that grassland area that has been, technically retained or even on this map isn't officially shown as changing over is quite a bit different from what we had previously. We also do have some forests here, but many of those are in areas that are explicitly protected. So the areas that haven't been converted into cities or agricultural landscapes, people have really made a conscious effort to maintain those and kind of have those be the outliers within modern Iowa. So just moving over to some of the important characteristics that we have regarding climate and water itself. When it comes to rainfall in Iowa, it follows this pretty consistent, well-known pattern where if you start up in the northwest corner of the state, you tend to get less rainfall. And as you move kind of directly diagonally across the state to the southeast corner, you tend to get more rainfall. And so kind of evens out. So if you're in somewhere in central Iowa here, you're basically sitting at around a statewide average. But that has big implications for stream flow and for certain areas of water quality. Because of the rainfall and because of some differences in land use and underlying geology, we get distinct patterns in stream flow too. And so this map over here on the right is showing several of the major rivers in Iowa. And specifically, it contains the relative amount of flow that each one of these rivers gets. So as a river gets bigger and bigger, it naturally, pretty much every single river is what's known as a gaining river in Iowa. It naturally gets more and more groundwater contribution to it, and it gets more and more stream flow. So what we often do to help um, describe and compare flow values from different rivers is take the water that's in there and divide it by its tributary area. And we get something that's called a yield, a stream flow yield. And that's a good way of just controlling for differences in river size. And so that's what's shown over here on the right plot. And we can see that in the northeast corner of the state, those are some of our relatively wettest rivers are. And consequently, we generally view water quantity as being less of a challenge in this part of the state. We generally think of water resources being more abundant in this neck of the woods of Iowa than we do in other parts of the region. The other thing that's really important is we have high seasonal variance in Iowa. So our seasons drive a whole bunch of things, and climate is top among those. Changes in rainfall are top among those. And so this plot just shows over here on the left the variance that we get, the changes in precipitation we get in the various months throughout the year. The general rule of thumb is that during the spring and summer months, that's when we tend to get more rainfall. That's when we tend to see our highest events, the biggest storms that will produce the most rainfall. These are averages over long periods of time. So, of course, we can still have very dry periods in the summer when we have prolonged instances of drought. We can even get periods in the winter where we can have a little bit of rainfall or a little bit of snowfall and snow melt. But by and large, the predominant rainfall, the wettest conditions that we have are in these spring and summer months. And that has big impacts for stream flow. If you just take the flow that goes through the Des Moines River and organize the water volume in each one of the months, you get a chart that looks like this over here on the right. So we see because of the rainfall influence, we tend to see higher flow values within the spring and the summer months. And so this is really important because stream flow is the dominant mechanism that transfers most of our water quality pollutants into our lakes and rivers. And so understanding stream flow and its contribution to interaction with different water quality pollutants is very important. Other thing that we should note is that in Iowa today, as I mentioned before, much of our land is agricultural. But the demographics that we have, where people live, doesn't really follow what our land use breakdown is. And so, even though about 85% of our land is agricultural, only about a third of Iowans live in what we would classify as rural areas, whereas about 63% live in urban areas or suburban areas surrounding urban cities. And we see some pretty distinct trends when it comes to where people are moving to and moving from. So, urban communities in Iowa, many of them are declining in population or maintaining relatively stagnant levels of people living there. Urban centers tend to be growing and getting more people. So, again, we have this demographic trends that don't really mirror or monitor some of the overall land use that we have within the state. And so, just to summarize this section here, again, if there's one point to take away, it's that Iowa's landscape is one of the most heavily altered and heavily engineered in the world. We don't have really any of our native landscape left, and that's had big implications for water quality and water quantity. So, just getting into the specific factors that have enacted this change and how they impact water, how they impact Iowa's water cycle. Probably one of the most obvious things that people talk about in this section is that when you replace a prairie and move it to something like conventional farmland, you're actually removing some of the water that would have otherwise been detained in that vegetation that was on the prairie or infiltrated down into the groundwater. You're taking that and you're generally facilitating it by moving it to the streams more quickly. So we don't have as much on-field upstream storage of water in local fields or local ponds in Iowa as we used to. The native prairie plants used to have really long roots. Again, they would hold on to water, and they had more of a capacity to evaporate the water than much of the current corn or soybean crops that we use now in Iowa. This picture here is actually of a typical landscape that made up the Des Moines Loeb region many, many years ago. These are called prairie potholes, and this is a good example of what that water retention looked like. Back in the day, it was fairly common to have clusters of these local little depressions or low spots in the landscape where water would hang out and sit for a while before being drained downstream. Now, a lot of these don't exist. Much of the water that would be placed in these locations is making its way to streams much more fully. And so land use change isn't the full story there. Another important factor is that there have actually been these artificial drainage systems that have been installed that have really helped with the facilitation and the draining of that water from the fields to the nearby streams and rivers. And so this really takes up two parts. One of the big parts here is just the presence of agricultural drainage ditches. So this is a very old picture shown on the right of how that would come into play. So people are literally digging out these areas across farm fields and having that as a way to facilitate water and moving it quickly into adjacent rivers and streams. Another big one is tile drainage. So some people may have heard of the term tile drainage before. It's actually a bit of I guess, an antiquated term, so to speak, because back in the day it was made out of these clay tile lines. But today it's actually, much more consists of plastic perforated pipes. And so next slide here, I'll just explain, what exactly tile drainage is, why people install it, and how it works. The main thing is tile drainage are these perforated pipes that you put in a few feet below the ground on farm fields, and people install them because it helps with farm productivity. Perhaps the most obvious thing is that if you were to have a farm field where there was a local low spot and you were getting a lot of ponding or a lot of flooding there, that ponded or flooding area, you can't really grow crops there. And so having that water drained and moved to the stream frees up additional area where people can grow crops. The more important reason, though, from an agriculturally productive standpoint, it's kind of highlighted by this picture over on the right. And that's when you lower the water table for crops like corn and soybean, it actually boosts their yields. So it gives the roots a bit more room to spread out and grow, and we can increase the productivity. They're just saying that corn likes to get its feet wet, and tile drainage definitely helps it do that. It brings the water table down to the appropriate level to maximize the growth of corn crops. So because of our situation in Iowa here, we actually have some of the most heavily tile drained fields and some of the biggest overall tile presence of any state in the nation. The map over here on the left kind of just shows how typical tiling works in action. You'll often have these long lines of parallel tile lines that are installed on a field, and this is what's called pattern tiling. And this is just used to bring that water table down to a nice consistent level throughout the entirety of the plot where the corn or soybean product is being produced. You'll see on this plot, or you see on this figure, that we have these green lines going through here. And this is a ditch that's going to collect that tile water. So once that tile water is brought down through the tile, it's discharged directly into an adjacent river or stream or ditch. And again, it's all for the purpose of trying to move that water quickly out of the landscape so that crop productivity can be increased. I said we had some of the highest levels of tile lines in the nation. Um, we don't exactly know where all of the tile is because a lot of tile is installed on private land. So we're often relying on survey results on farmers to report if the land is tiled or not to identify the general proportion of tile lands that we have in Iowa. But no matter which way you slice it, we have tile in most parts of the state, and some areas have been really, really heavily and really, really densely tiled. Typically in that Des Moines Lobe area where you have a lot of low-lying areas where water has historically ponded on a field site. So another thing that's happened that's influenced the facilitation of water to rivers and streams is this concept of stream straightening. And we've got an example of that shown here. This is the same little reach of a stream back in the day, almost 100 years ago now, and we see that it curved and bended and meandered a lot. And that's how most of the streams used to be in Iowa. But what we've done is we've gone in and straightened those. And we've done that for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it just helps, again, facilitate that water's movement downstream. So it enables water to move downstream very quickly in a controlled environment. And preventing the stream from meandering like this also helps with some erosion control and helps it from butting up against various properties where it might cause damage or cause issues. So if you got a stream that's nice and straight, you don't really have to worry about it going into adjacent croplands or properties and damaging sorts of things. But that comes at a cost. A lot of times when you have this condition, this meandering would actually reduce some of the stream power. But when you're straightening a stream, all of that power, all of that energy that was previously dissipated is kind of just sent downstream for the next lower community to deal with. So you may not get erosion here, but you're likely going to get increased erosion at a water body that's a little bit further downstream from where the stream was straight. And then finally, the other big change that we've had is urbanization. So we've had many, many cities being built in Iowa, and even today we see this continued urban sprawl in places like Cedar Rapids and places like the Des Moines suburbs. And when you make a transition from a farmland into an urban area, which is mostly what's happening now with these increasing locations, you actually get even bigger runoff response than you did when you're making the transition from prairie into farmland. And so anytime you are converting land that produced some infiltration into landscapes that are filled with pavement or with roofs or impermeable surfaces, you're getting even more runoff, and you're usually getting runoff at a quicker rate. And so unless you've got specific practices that are installed within an urban area that produce infiltration and will hold on to the water and release it slowly, generally we see an increased response, increased stream flow downstream following urbanization and stream flow occurring at quicker rates. So a couple of other notes here, just about how Iowa's economy and how some of the agricultural practices have shifted throughout the years. This is kind of a fun plot because it summarizes the history of row crop agriculture in Iowa, probably just into one figure. So this is the number of acres that we've had in Iowa that have been harvested with the major crops going back over 150 years. And so you can kind of see the story of corn. Corn has always been a major player in Iowa, even dating back to the 1800s. It became the dominant crop very quickly, and it's remained that to this day. We used to have bigger markets with wheat, bigger markets with oats. But those have largely been phased out. And today we really only have major rotations between corn and soybeans, which is this green line here, which really took off in the 1960s and the 1970s. A lot of these have developed into what's known as a monoculture. And so you have a field here, very different from its native condition, that's just made up of these crops that are in rows here. So again, that'll traditionally be either corn or soybean. And those are the major players that we have in Iowa's agriculture today. So a couple of the major water quality concerns that have resulted from this sort of change, probably the biggest one that we've heard about in the news over the past couple of years is the idea of nutrients. And so nutrients have been influenced quite a bit because of all the agricultural changes that we've shifted, and especially through this shift to intensive agricultural practices. So the issue around nutrients can maybe be a little bit confusing or a little bit counterintuitive because these are essential things that all plants and animals need to survive, including all of us. But when you have too many nutrients in Iowa's water, they become really harmful environmental pollutants. And so anytime we're talking about nutrients in this context, it's pretty much just nitrogen and phosphorus that are the two problematic ones that are causing a lot of water quality issues. And so really what this has resulted from is man-made influences on the natural nitrogen and the natural phosphorus cycle. Because of our shift to intensive agriculture, we've disrupted where a lot of these nutrients normally are, and that's resulted in more of them entering our water bodies. And that's caused several environmental problems that Alyssa will talk about a little bit later. But people have done studies and looked, in Iowa as a whole, where do these nutrients tend to come from the most? And they mainly are linked to environmental or to agricultural practices. We see with nitrogen over here on the right-hand side of the slide, about 40 of it comes from synthetic fertilizer that's produced or that's applied to crops, about 20% from manure, 20% from fixation. So certain crops, when they grow, can actually produce nitrogen as a byproduct of their growth. Soybean is typically the biggest culprit for this. Then other sources, particularly urban land use or wastewater treatment, is pretty minimal when it comes to nitrogen. This is the breakdown for phosphorus. Similar numbers in that we get about 5% coming from fertilizer, about 20% coming from manure. Urban and developed areas and wastewater treatment plants are a bigger source from phosphorus, but still not the main one. Another big issue that we have here in Iowa and other parts of the country and the world is really this topic of emerging contaminants. I've got pesticides shown here as an example because we use a lot of pesticides in Iowa. Pretty much every pesticide that's widely used on corn and soybeans, Iowa is a leader in. And so this is a map showing glyphosate, which is the number one pesticide that gets used in Iowa nowadays. And so we're kind of at the center of the bullseye when it comes to glyphosate application. And many of these pesticides, many other contaminants, they're things that have been created synthetically, so not really natural in any sort of context, but created synthetically with a specific purpose of benefiting some sort of economic, industrial, or manufacturing process. And they're called emerging contaminants because they've generally been less well studied and less well understood than things like sediment or nutrients or bacteria. Again, because they've only come into use and distribution over these past several years. And so with these, a lot of the health impacts isn't widely known or isn't widely understood because they are new and because we don't have a great handle in many cases just how prevalent they are within our water and what the exact exposure risks are associated with each one of these. And then finally, last thing I wanted to talk about, which involves a lot of water quality issues, is the idea of manure from animal livestock. So the manure that we produce within the state is really a byproduct of rearing different animals for agricultural purposes. And this can influence water quality in many ways. So this manure that's produced is full of nutrients. It can potentially harbor bacteria that can make its way into water, and it can also contain several different emerging contaminants that can also be problematic. Here within Iowa, this industry has taken off over the last 20 to 30 years or so, but it's always been a major player. It's always had a big impact on Iowa's economy and the environment. So it's important to understand when it comes to that manure that's managed properly can actually be a resource. So the nutrients that are in that manure, if applied to a field at a correctly prescribed rate, can help crops grow. There's also potential to use some of this manure in what are called anaerobic digesters. So you can basically digest or decompose the manure and use it as a process for generating energy. But manure that's improperly managed, that's improperly disposed of, can cause several different harmful water quality issues. As I mentioned, this is coming to focus over the last several decades, and a lot of that is just because we have more animals now than we ever did before. We've seen pretty significant increase in our hog population. So that used to be maybe about 20 years ago or so, we had 15 million hogs in the state. Now that number is up to about 25 million. And we've also seen an increase in the poultry population as well. That's not the only thing that's at play here. The other factors, we've also seen this really industrialization and convergence of many family farms, and just the agricultural industry in general. And so that's what this plot over here on the right shows. The number of farms that we have in Iowa is continually going down. The average size of the farm has continually been going up. And when you have all these animals stored in one place in one of those concentrated animal feeding operations, generally manure is hard to manage in that case. When it's more diffuse, when it's more spread out on a family farm, on a landscape, then it doesn't present as many potential environmental problems as it does when it's more concentrated. So, in summary, with this section, Iowa's modern landscape and its history is behind a lot of the water quality and quantity challenges that we face. And now I'll turn into Alyssa, who will get into some of the specific numbers behind that.
Thanks, Elliot. So I'll get in more to the actual like water use in Iowa and talk about a lot of where does our water actually come from that we're using. So to start, I just want to point out that Iowa is a very riverine state with just a few lakes. Unlike our neighbors to the north in Minnesota and Wisconsin, Iowa is not the land of 10,000 lakes. We're actually the land of 34. That's how many natural lakes are from the state of Iowa. More realistically, we're the land of 10,000 rivers. The rivers dominate our landscape, no matter what landform you live in. And Iowa is actually a cool state too. We're actually the only state completely bordered by two major rivers, the Missouri to the west and the Mississippi to the east. Um, so below that surface, groundwater is super abundant. Um, we are very lucky that we have the groundwater resources that we do here in the Midwest. Just for a point of clarification, I want to point out that aquifers are the containers where groundwater is stored. But then groundwater itself is all of that water found in both the soil and in aquifers. You'll hear some people use these interchangeably. Generally, people just mean groundwater unless they're talking about a very specific portion, like in the Cambrian Ordovician aquifer. That's the Jordan aquifer that we use to drink out of in the eastern part of the state. Okay, so then looking at this diagram here, if we were to take a cross section of Iowa from the northeast to the southwest, this is kind of what our bedrock geology and aquifer geology would look like. So we see in the northeast here, we have shallow access to some of these large aquifers, but there's nothing covering it up to the north in the northeast, which means that they might be susceptible to contamination. Whereas in the southwest and the western part of the state, the aquifers are much deeper, but we do have access to some shallower aquifers here as well. So kind of talking about how the groundwater can be more susceptible or less susceptible to contamination. There's two main types I want you guys to know about. The first is unconfined aquifers. So these tend to be shallow, they recharge quickly, the flow is controlled primarily by gravity, and then these can be impacted by changes in climate, especially because that groundwater is young. And because they're susceptible to that surface contamination, we need to be careful about what kind of activities are happening in that area. That's in contrast with the confined aquifer, which would be deeper here. So they tend to be deeper and they recharge very, very slowly. So slow that they can be considered a non-renewable resource in a human life scale. The flow is primarily controlled by pressure, and then they're not impacted by those changes in climate as much. That groundwater is much older, and it's usually cleaner because it's not susceptible to contamination, but it's important to note that it's still, somewhat of a non-renewable resource there. So then kind of getting back to the Iowa aquifers, if we look at it from a top-down view now, in the Northeast, we have really good access to those aquifers. They're shallow, they're highly productive, but they're susceptible to that contamination because of the landscape and the karst region in the Northeast part of the state. Mhm. So as we go to the Northwest part of the state, we still have fair access to the aquifers there. We tend to do more of the Dakota aquifer, which is a shallow aquifer. But then we're also accessing a lot of the alluvial aquifers, which are those shallow, unconfined aquifers that are susceptible to contamination. And then in the southern part of the state, this is where we tend to use more surface water for drinking just because the aquifer quality is not as good. These are the alluvial aquifers and the drift aquifers, which are both those unconfined aquifers with good ties to the surface. So now that we know where the groundwater is, how do we use it? And by and large, it's for these public water supplies. About half of all of the groundwater used in Iowa is for drinking water. And the other uses are for things like just domestic household uses, industrial water, and then in agriculture, it makes up about 20% between both irrigation and livestock. And of the drinking water supplies by our source, only about 20% of the water in Iowa is used for of from rivers and lakes is being used for drinking water. Otherwise, most of the water is coming from the shallow, unconfined aquifers, things like glacial drift and the alluvium. Specifically in Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, we use a lot of alluvial sources just next to the rivers here. So they always have a good access of water, but they are susceptible to contamination. And the smallest portion of groundwater used for drinking water in Iowa is in these confined aquifers. So these tend to be deeper, and they're just more expensive to tap into, especially when you're in that southwest part of the state. So just as a summary, I found in the Iowa Drought Plan from the Iowa DNR in 2023, they outlined some of the water uses in Iowa. And this is super interesting because what they said is that only about 13% of the water withdrawn for use in Iowa is considered to be consumed. So water can be used in two ways. It can be consumed where it's integrated into a plant or into drinking water for a person, and then it's essentially taken out of the water cycle and you can't use it again. The other version of water is non-consumable. So that's where an industry would use the water for whatever purpose they need. And then once they're done with it, they would clean it and then put it back, which means that that water will be eventually accessible in the water cycle again. Um, Please note that the groundwater is actually about 2/3 of the water that's consumed in Iowa. So that means that we're really not consuming that much of surface water. We're actually consuming more groundwater. By and large, the largest amount of water used in Iowa is for power generation. So they use it for the production of steam and for just cooling equipment in power plants. And most of that water comes from surface water sources in the big rivers like Mississippi, Missouri, and then also the Cedar River, Iowa River. And our second largest use of water is for using for public supplies. So that's for drinking water, for just, domestic uses. And altogether, including Iowans who are on their own private wells, about 80% of Iowans are depending on groundwater for that drinking water source. So this is a resource that we need to make sure is protected. And then, of course, other major uses of groundwater in Iowa include things for irrigation, livestock, and poultry production. Um, I will note that although Iowa has a lot of agriculture, we do not dominate the United States as far as center pivot irrigation goes. We actually just use irrigation more for supplemental reasons because we do have enough rain that tends to fall, which is good. So then finally putting everything together that we've kind of talked about today. Pollutants in Iowa waters come from both point and non-point sources. So point sources are generally those regulated um, waste generators. So there'll be things like industrial plants, wastewater treatment plants. Basically, if you can go out and point to a pipe where that water is going directly into a river, you can say, yeah, they probably have a NPDES discharge permit, and they have rules that they have to follow, and they can't just pollute willy-nilly. However, with non-point sources, these are generally unregulated. So those would include things like runoff from farm fields, runoff from, a parking lot, that would be stormwater runoff, and then, anything from like a suburban area, from lawns and grass. Those are all non-point sources, and those are not regulated. One important thing to note, though, is that if you do see a tile line going into a river, that is technically a pipe that you can point to, but that does count as a non-point source. Those fall under the category of runoff, so those are not regulated in most cases. So talking now about just, the big pollutants in Iowa and some of their effects. Bacteria pollution can come from a multitude of places, including, just plain manure runoff from farms, from both CAFOs or just, a backyard chicken coop. If you're on a beach and you see a lot of goose and bird waste, those often will have enough bacteria to close beaches down. And then some older wastewater treatment plants that don't have the new technology may have excess bacteria pollution. So the local effects of these things are things like beach closures, and then contamination to drinking water sources, which would, cost Iowans problems with being able to recreate, and also it increases the cost for um, making sure you have clean water. And there are some health problems associated with bacteria. Some obvious ones are just GI upset. You can have some infections. There can be things like skin rashes. So all things that we need to make sure that people are not being impacted by. Occasionally, you'll see where small cities will have boil orders. Generally, those are not from, things like the beaches or surface water. Those will be from pipe breakages underneath the ground. So if that pipe breaks and it gets into your tap, there could definitely be some bacteria in that. And that's why you would need to boil your water just to make sure it's safe from any excess bacteria in the system. And another big pollutant in Iowa is obviously the nitrate and the nitrite pollution. These come from fertilizer runoff, the ammonia tanks that you see spraying. Those are sources of nitrate to the system. If you have excess manure runoff that's not properly put out on the system, even things like leaky septic systems can have nitrate pollution to the environment. And nitrate has known pollution or known effects to human health. The one that is regulated for is the acute blue baby syndrome, which is the has a long name I'm bad at pronouncing. It's like methohemoglobemia, something like that. I'm not that kind of doctor. But if an infant is exposed to nitrate levels that are too high, it can cause their blood to not transport oxygen correctly. And that would be an emergency room visit to make sure that the baby will be okay. If pregnant women are exposed to too high of nitrate concentrations in their drinking water, it could lead to preterm birth or low birth weight for their babies. There's also been lower level chronic risks to linking to cancers like colorectal, breast, and prostate. So obviously nitrate is a bad thing to have in drinking water, and there are solutions to remove it, but it can be expensive. Um, the Des Moines Water Works uses ion exchange in their system to remove the nitrate to make sure that the water is safe and below that legal limit of 10 milligrams per liter for Iowans. Um, Household units are, similar to water softeners, will also work for that. And then reverse osmosis is also another way to remove that. If you ever live in an area and you know that your nitrate is high in your water, do not boil your water thinking that will make it better. Boiling only works for bacteria, but if you're going to boil for nitrates, that actually makes it worse because the water evaporates away and it leaves more and more nitrate in that water. You really have to do the ion exchange or reverse osmosis in order to remove it. Another thing to note is that nitrate concentrations in many Iowan rivers are exceeding their historic natural levels, and then as a whole, the nitrate levels in Iowa rivers are among highest in the nation. So as an example, in the Des Moines River, historic levels were quite low, less than 1. But more recently, they're up to 6. And especially last summer, we're seeing continually high levels where we had to use that nitrate removal system for quite a few days over the summer. In particular, the Des Moines and Raccoon Rivers fall over the 95th percentile of most nitrate in the watershed compared to all of the other places in the United States, which is, a problem that has been plaguing Iowa for a while. Like Elliot said before, other nutrients that we're concerned about are phosphorus. Generally, we're not in freshwater systems, we're not actually concerned about phosphorus itself. It's actually the effects that phosphorus can have when combined with hot temperatures and stagnant water. In certain cases, harmful algal blooms can form, and those can be toxic to both people and pets trying to swim. So local effects from those will be beach closures. You could even have drinking water contamination from those microcystins, which are the toxins found in the harmful blue-green algae. So solutions to keep the harmful algal blooms at bay would be to reduce the phosphorus runoff. So in some cases, you would dredge the sediments out from the bottom of a lake to remove the excess legacy phosphorus. But in most cases, you would try and, fight it at the source. An example of where that has been done successfully has been in Black Hawk Lake, Iowa. So this was achieved with a comprehensive watershed improvement plan aimed at lowering those phosphorus levels. So they did things like reduce phosphorus being used in the watershed, reduce the runoff of nutrients that were applied, and I believe they did a little bit of dredging to reduce some of that legacy phosphorus. And they've been very successful. Ever since about 2015, the microcystin levels have been low, which means that this lake is actually a lot safer for recreation and able to be used for fun in Iowa, which is a really cool thing. And this is, I have to do a nod to this because this is more of my expertise, but there's a lot of other emerging contaminants that can be found in Iowa. Things like pesticides, pharmaceuticals, PFAS forever chemicals, and microplastics have been found in basically every surface water body in Iowa. They can come from a multitude of places, including agricultural runoff, industrial waste, and wastewater treatment plant discharge. It's interesting to note, though, that just because um, if you see a pesticide, it doesn't automatically mean that it came from a farm field. We've seen pesticides in wastewater treatment plant discharge, and we also see it a lot in urban runoff as well. And then PFAS are pretty much found um, in every water source, unfortunately. They tend to gather in more of the large rivers just because of the industrial effects, and they kind of accumulate over time. Even though these are found in many places around Iowa, they're not necessarily as high concentrations as a nutrient or harmful algal bloom or bacteria. So because their levels are so low, and it makes it really difficult to link actually to a health effect. But there have been lab studies to suggest that there's effects including endocrine disruption, maybe some reproductive problems, and even some cancers. So overall, what are the effects of pollution in Iowa? The EPA does a classification of impaired waters every 4 years, and more than half of Iowa rivers are classified as impaired. Most of the impairments come from elevated bacteria, nitrates, and nitrite, which makes sense knowing the background of Iowa. But what this means for us is that there's less opportunity for recreation to really use our water to the greatest potential. And there's going to be a higher cost to treat the drinking water to ensure that it's safe for Iowans. Um, it's also important to note that climate change, it has likely increased the flood and the drought risk. It's increasing the flood risk because when it rains really hard. We get a lot of water at once. That it's also promoting more runoff, which is, worsening pollution as well. And then with the droughts, we end up with drier periods between, which actually in turn makes flooding worse because the ground is not able to properly soak in the rainfall. It's also important to note that the population growth in the urban centers and economic development have also increased the water demand. Since about the 1990s, for Des Moines customers, there's been about a 5 billion gallon increase. So this is going to put extra pressure on the city to keep removing the nitrates, and it's going to, downstream the cost to the consumers as well. So we want to leave you guys with some, things that you can take home, maybe some actions. So the first thing you can do is just be involved in water quality education, which you're already doing, and you're doing a great job. Um, I would highly suggest if you're on a private well that you get your private well water tested at least once a year. A general homeowner test will run you about 60 bucks, and it'll be for things like nitrate, conductivity, pH, and bacteria. Those are things that you can reach out to your local community health department or county health department, and they can help set you up with those testing. And occasionally they have grants as well to get them at almost free cost. If you're concerned about your actual water quality in your home from your tap water, I would recommend using a certified carbon filter, adding a water softener, or even an RO system for your drinking water. And then on a larger local regional level, I would suggest that you participate in and vote for people to continue to fund sampling and monitoring efforts. We don't know what the problems are if we don't look for them. Additionally, I suggest that we protect and enhance habitats and those riparian corridors to do things like reduce runoff and reduce erosion. But overall, I think we have, learned a few lessons and hopefully we can connect some of these things with you guys and we're ready for that Q&A as well. I guess we probably won't.
Yeah. Do
Thank you so much. Um,
you want us to stop sharing, Katie? Should we keep the slides up? Do you have a
Yeah.
preference?
um,
I'll pull you up here so we can at
Based
least
on the
see.
questions, I don't think you'll need the slides, so maybe
Okay.
get some FaceTime.
Yeah, it depends on the questions. How do you want to
So,
do those? Do you want us to scroll through or?
um, I can share the two that I see, just a few. Some got answered as you went. The the one that lands on what you just talked about was Annie's asking, don't osmosis systems end up wasting a lot of water with higher concentrations of what's being removed going to the
They
ground, septic or water?
Yeah, they can. That's why it's recommended to just use it for your drinking water source. You can either get they have countertop versions. So the best that I've seen is like a 1 to 3, like good water to wastewater. They have under sink versions too, where like you just have like one spout that you're using just to like reduce the waste that you have for the water. Um, but yeah, I mean, in order to have the good clean water, they do waste quite a bit, which is why you don't want to do it for your whole house.
The other question that came, and if folks have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat or use the Q&A and I'll pull them up. Melissa asked about, would data centers be designated as commercial or municipal water? And would it be considered consumable?
So typically that's going to fall under commercial. So they're an industry, they're a business, just like any other sort of resource in the area or manufacturing company or factory that's going to draw water from the specific water source that it needs. And so data centers, big issue right now, not just in Iowa. And of course, the big concern around them is they need a lot of water to conduct their cooling. And so there's been quite a bit of discussion there, but they would fall under the typical commercial permitted use that we have.
Mm. Yeah, I've tried to look into that too, just to see how much water they're going to be using, and it's not super clear either. I think it's going to be closer to kind of how the power plants are using water. Just, they use that water to cool things down, but eventually they would be putting them back into the system, is my understanding.
Okay. Say a quick shout out to the folks on the call. We just worked with some folks in Story County. They want a local moratorium on data centers in the unincorporated rural areas of Story County.
Cool.
And CCI members, there's surveys going out next week if you think we should start working on this issue. So watch your mailboxes. Another water treatment question. Are water softeners as effective as reverse osmosis systems with removing contaminants, especially nitrates and PFAs?
So to answer it broadly, no. Reverse osmosis is kind of considered the gold standard. If you want a treatment process that's going to release or reduce the most contaminants as possible,
Mm,
reverse osmosis is going to be your bet. It varies depending on the particular pollutant that you're interested in. So we generally think of when it comes to nitrate, them roughly being equivalent as to what you would get between water softening and the filter that it passes through for reverse osmosis. I think there was another question specifically about PFAS in that scenario. For something like PFAS, it wouldn't be as effective. It really water softening depends specifically on the contaminant that you're interested in, and it's usually going to be those ionic dissolved compounds that it's most successful at removing.
mhm.
A lot of folks are.
Yeah, PFAS can be decently removed with those carbon filters. I believe that there's multiple brands that have those ANSI, ANSI
Mhm.
certifications. Those are the ones I would look for. Um, the longer chain PFAS are more readily removed with that carbon filter. So things that are like 8 carbons and more. So that's your PFOA and PFOS, which will be regulated as of 2031. The shorter chain ones are generally not going to be as effective with the carbon filters, but reverse osmosis would take care of those as well.
Um, Caitlin is asking, for those with private wells, is there a specific time of the year that are better for to get your wells tested than others?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
It depends on what, if you historically have had any issues. I would say any time of the year is good. There's no
Hmm.
bad situation to do it. But typically, and especially if the issue is nitrate, we tend to think of nitrate being most concerning in May or June. So that's most likely when you're going to have the highest nitrate concentrations there. But I will mention that groundwater systems are generally much more slow moving and much less dynamic than surface water, rivers and streams. And so you're likely not going to see as much variation in your groundwater as you will if you were collecting water from any sort of surface water source. And so the timing isn't that important, but generally I'd probably say spring or summer would be the best time to do it.
One time that you should always test your well, though, is if there's a flooding incident on your land. And if the water goes up to your well cap, or submerges your well cap, you need to test because there's likely bacteria from the flood water.
Just some discussion about testing at a well.
I did see one
What about
question is maybe
nitrates?
getting at jargon surrounding pesticides. So typically pesticides is an all-inclusive term that applies to any
Mhm.
sort of chemical that's applied to get rid of some unwanted organism.
Designed to
So
kill.
yeah, we use pesticides inclusively, and then it's broken down into insecticides, insects, herbicides, plants, fungicides, fungus. So that's how
Mhm.
the jargon and the nomenclature around that specific set of chemicals typically works.
I see a question asking what percent of nitrates should be removed using a quality RO under sink filter. I don't know any exact percentages, do you?
Well, you typically think about reverse osmosis just
Right.
removing all of them
Right.
that goes through. Many of these more sophisticated nitrate removal facilities, the way that they actually work in practice over in Des Moines is anything that they send through the nitrate removal facility, pretty much all the nitrate gets removed, but they're only sending a certain subset of their water through that. So they might get water that is maybe something like 12 milligrams per liter, and they'll send half of it through the nitrate removal facility in order to get it down to something like 8 milligrams per liter. So typically we think about these systems being very effective in removing most of the water or most of the water contamination that they're designed to. It's often just what percent of the actual water do you put through that system? That's the driving force behind what the final concentration is.
Yeah, I see the comment from Alan asking about, he's like, oh, there's some nitrate in his RO system. Might be time to change the filter if it's not being as effective as it used to be.
Yeah, with all these treatment sources,
Yeah.
they require maintenance, right?
Hmm.
And sometimes you can have the bad situation where you don't replace a filter past the prescribed limit, and you can get some bacteria buildup on that. So we just recommend anytime people do use their own point of use treatment sources to do that within the prescribed limits, change things out as it's recommended by the manufacturer.
I see a question too about pesticides in tap water. So I would say generally we don't see too many pesticides in the tap water, but there have been cases. We did a study in Iowa City a few years back. They found that there were neonic insecticides found in the finished drinking water at the university, but not at the city. And they used two different water plants. And the difference between those is that the water plant at the city has a large carbon filter basin, and that was removing most of the pesticides in comparison to the university, which does not have that removal. So I'd say if the nitrates are really, really high, like there's a chance of co-occurrence because if you have nitrates from ag, it's likely that there's other compounds that are coming with it as well.
Yeah, when it comes to pesticides specifically in our rivers, a lot of them are only present during a couple of days of the year in large quantities. So they typically get applied in the spring, and the first three, four, maybe five rainfall events will wash a lot of those pesticides off into the water after that. And so, in some sense, that's good that they're not as ever present as something like nitrate or bacteria potentially, but it also makes it a little bit trickier to measure and get our head around just how much are in the state of Iowa at any given
Mhm.
time, because they tend to be more episodic than some of these other pollutants.
You see the time. We can stick around for more questions, but folks are already logging off. You will get a short exit survey. It's not a canned survey from Zoom. I wrote it this afternoon. Super short. Won't take you very long. Would love it. Your feedback will help us know what you thought, what you found helpful tonight, or suggestions, and just to get a better sense of where your interests are with this water topic. Um, yeah. And I would also just add, as your membership director here, if you liked tonight's presentation, know it was made possible by Iowa CCI members and membership dues. Even if you didn't like it, it was made possible by your membership dues. So we're a membership-based organization. Our members are super engaged, involved, active in lots of ways, and they support with a financial contribution each year. Just $25 for an individual, $35 for a household. Stayed the same since 1995 when we started being membership dues. So this work is about us. It's for us. We believe we want to fund it ourselves too, so we can keep it really independent and nimble. So consider that if you're not already a member. Um, Other than that, I don't see any more questions.
Oh, neither do we.
Well, I
Lots of
will just
thanks
say
and
if
gratitude.
if things pop up in the future, Katie, I believe you have our contact information. You can
Mhm.
disseminate that in the slides we used today, and are happy to chat with people at a later date.
Okay,
Yeah,
that
definitely.
sounds good. And then somebody did ask, will you be willing to share the slides?
Yeah, more than happy to.
Mhm.
Okay, so if I can get those from you, I'll send them out tomorrow. What else is there? Oh, and Morgan's, there's about 20 people. I don't know how many people over there. There are about 15 people next door watching along too. So
Fun. Heard you guys had
thank
pizza. I hope it
you.
was good.
It's Casey's. It's easy.
The classic Iowa choice.
Oh, it's easy. They're everywhere. Not that many people deliver anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
So EVS, you said thank you. I'm not sure who you are, but I will try and include their contact information for you. Other than that, thank you, everybody. They're clapping next door. I can hear
Yep.
it.
Oh,
Yeah,
I
well,
see. Thanks for calling us clear communicators. We'll have to let our friend know who has done intense training with us. We are
Oh,
ingrained at this point.
excellent.
yeah.
Um,
Thank you everyone for your attention this evening. Really appreciate sharing our work with you, and happy Earth Day.
Yeah, happy Earth Day.